right now we're going to turn our focus to the man out in Pittsburgh, the man who was in the cauldron of it all this weekend, Adam Bittner of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, the digital editor out there, and a Penn State grad, but obviously knows the Pittsburgh market very well. You were in a very interesting spot to view that game this weekend, my friend, and what were your initial thoughts?
Well, it was quite a beatdown, obviously. I was a little bit surprised by the margin, if for no other reason than the conditions were pretty miserable at Heinz Field, which is already kind of notorious for having a terrible playing surface. So, I kind of thought it would be a closer game. I thought Penn State would still win comfortably, but I didn't envision kind of really what materialized, especially in that second half.
Well, and I'm sure part of that, Adam, is the fact that we came off a week where the Penn State community saw this Nittany Lion team struggle to get by App State and then have a lot of questions through the first two quarters of that game at Heinz Field. Was there a switch that was flicked from the Penn State side? Was it Pitt running out of gas? What, in your mind, changed so dramatically in the second half of that football game?
Well, I think, in a lot of ways, this team, at least early, is kind of showing maybe similar DNA to the 2016 team in that, it can kind of look pretty bad for a few quarters, but they have the ability to adjust. I still think back to, I was actually in the car for the halftime interview with James Franklin during the App State game. And he was saying that, there's one guy on each side of the ball that's maybe messing up and on each play. And that's kind of putting us behind the eight ball. And I think in both of these games, you've kind of seen there were certainly breakdowns in the second half of the App State game, but there were also a lot of, especially on the offensive side, positives where things really started to click. And I think you saw both sides kind of click in the second half of the Pitt game. You don't want to make too much of two games, especially two non-conference games. But I think it's a positive development that we have seen adjustments kind of going well for this team.
So you find yourself in Pittsburgh after the game. Penn State, Pitt fans conglomerate, they merge after that game. You know the smack talk that was going into that game on both sides. Walk us through what the scene was after that game and perhaps the scene on Sports Talk Radio in Pittsburgh right now in terms of the folks that follow that program and have been so invested in this rivalry.
Well, Sports Talk Radio and reality are two different places. So I pretty much the whole day on Saturday, I thought, both sides were really kind of getting along. That's something I've observed during both matchups here in Pittsburgh is that, this game really, really is at its best a celebration of college football in Pittsburgh. I think you have passionate fans of the sport on both sides. And this is, kind of that moment that we kind of get to celebrate what we love in college football in a town that's so often dominated by the Steelers. Obviously, the next day, Sports Talk Radio was already really talking mostly about the tie against the Cleveland Browns. I think the Pitt fans were a little quiet after the game, but I think, if you're talking about the scene and how people are interacting, I think for the most part, you get two people who two fan bases that recognize that this is ultimately a celebration of the sport, and it was fun even if it was a little rainy outside.
Hey Adam, this is Tyler Galhouse. Quick question for you about James Franklin, some of the decisions he made late in the game. For example, first play, Sean Clifford throwing a touchdown bomb. Also the challenge that he had with the Ricky Slade fumble, and also, people were complaining he was still throwing the ball up 45 points at the end. I just wanted to get your take on that, and maybe what some of the Pittsburgh people out there have been saying about James Franklin.
Well, I think something I brought up on Twitter this week is that there's a lot of debate before and after these games about whether this is a rivalry between the teams or not. And, the players are going to have to speak to that, and very often they don't really have anything to say. But I think it's very clear that it is a personal rivalry between James Franklin and Pat Narduzzi. And I think that's what you saw in those decisions by James Franklin is that, whether or not these two teams hate each other, whether or not the two fan bases feel the same way about each other, that contempt definitely goes two ways between Franklin and Narduzzi. Narduzzi said his fair share of things, and I think, on Franklin's end, he's kind of responding in kind when he has a chance to rub Narduzzi's face in it. So that's kind of how I interpreted it, more as a personal thing. I'm not sure, I'm sure you can have a different explanation for it, but that's kind of what I saw.
Well, and what a difference a couple of years makes for Pat Narduzzi in that fan base as well. He comes onto the scene, beats Penn State in their first matchup, the return of the rivalry. He makes a big deal of it. James Franklin, of course, that is when it appeared that he might have started to be on the hot seat. A loss 2 weeks later to Michigan. He's down 10 at the half against Minnesota the week after that. And so, how things have flipped between these two programs. Of course, I don't need to ask about James Franklin's job security like we were talking about perhaps 2 years ago, but where does Pat Narduzzi stand from where you can tell?
Well, I mean, he just got an extension last year, actually. So he has, a lot of time left on his contract. Pitt's going to be paying him for a long time. So I feel like unless he completely face plants this year with like a 3-9 type of performance, he's definitely not going anywhere this year.
Yeah, I was going to say, though, that doesn't always matter with Pitt, as we've seen with, Jamie had some time on his contract, did he not? And then, of course, Stallings after the 1 year from a basketball perspective.
Well, I think there was, I think that extension was a recognition that Pitt has been through so much turbulence in recent years, and that more than anything else has kind of created, the instability in the program. It hasn't necessarily been one coach or another. Obviously you have a guy like Todd Graham or Paul Chryst choose to leave, and that's not really on Pitt, but I think they want to lock down a coach for the long term. And I actually wrote a couple years ago about, what type of model could Pitt football follow to, kind of get back to national relevance. Maybe not be on a Penn State level every year, but at least, be contending for conference championships. Maybe every 2 or 3 years you put together a team that's really, can really make a run, at the top 5. And, a program that I looked at was Gary Pinkel's Missouri teams for about a 5-year period there at the beginning of the decade. They were in the top 10, the top 5 a lot. They were solid teams. They weren't, tearing the cover off the ball while recruiting. They were getting a lot of 3- and 4-star, low 4-star guys out of places like Texas and Oklahoma. They were getting the players that Texas and Oklahoma didn't want. They were putting them into a 5-year system, and they were making those pieces fit together very well. I think Narduzzi, if you look at what Pitt's been doing in recruiting, they've really shifted their focus to Florida. Of all the teams that have moved into the ACC or into the SEC, in the last 15, 20 years, Pitt has gotten more kids out of Florida in the past, few recruiting cycles than any of them. So Pitt's really trying to play up that recruiting, connection. And I think, if you're Pitt, you kind of want to give that a few more years to mature, to see, if you could start getting results. So I think unless he really takes things, off the cliff this year or next, that, he's pretty secure still.
Talking to Adam Bittner of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, the digital editor there. And we'll get it back to Penn State now. I want to talk about the linebackers, and we are seeing, I think, the evolution of that position over just 120 minutes of football this year. And you're already seeing Jesse Luketa and Ellis Brooks getting more and more snaps behind Jan Johnson. You're seeing Micah Parsons now get to the level of snaps that you're seeing from Koa Farmer as well. That wasn't the case in the first football game against App State. Where do you see this continue to evolve over the course of the year? Do you think that Jan Johnson will be the starting middle linebacker after the bye, or will one of the freshmen come up and get it? And what do you see Koa Farmer's role being the rest of the year?
Well, I think that's the purpose of a lot of this is that you want to have the depth. I don't know. I think especially on the defensive line last year, we saw that there were a lot of guys that got time, and I think that's kind of played into their favor this year. As they've lost guys up front. Is that they weren't returning a ton of quote unquote starters, but they were returning a lot of players who had experience. So I think if you're Brent Pry in that defense, the important thing, especially in the early going here, is finding out what kind of depth you have. I'm not so concerned with how it's going to play out at this position in the next, because I think kind of the purpose and why you recruit as well as Penn State has is so that you have options, that you can play that hot hand. And you can kind of go take things on a week-by-week basis. And that's kind of what I've observed with the linebacking core, is that, You want to get as many guys as you can contributing, so that, you have experience up and down the depth chart. I think, we think about 2016, what happened when they had a couple of injuries in that linebacking core. Things combusted very quickly at Michigan, and that arguably cost them a chance at the college football playoffs. So I think, you shouldn't just be paying attention to what the top of the depth chart is. I think, getting that depth and experience is important too.
While we're on the linebacker talk here, Adam, Micah Parsons had 6 more snaps than Koa Farmer on defense at the weak side linebacker spot. I guess they call it the will. Is that something that you see as a trend moving forward? Parsons beginning to play more than Koa Farmer, even if that doesn't mean he's the starter listed on the depth chart?
That's certainly possible. I also think, you want to keep in perspective what was going on in that second half. Obviously, there were a lot of people that were further down the depth chart that were getting more snaps than they might have been if it was a tighter game. So I don't know how much you want to read into, kind of what the snaps were in the second half. Because you don't know how that's going to translate to, certainly like an Ohio State or a game, further down the road. I mean, if you're Penn State, obviously a guy with that much talent, really the headliner of that recruiting class, you really hope that he can come in and take that job, probably, because he probably has more tools than Koa Farmer does. But, I don't want to diminish Koa's, experience and, the big games he's been in. He brings things to that equation as well. So I think it all comes back to depth and just knowing what's right in the right situations.
Adam Bittner on with us here from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Last one for you here. I think a lot of folks were clearly looking forward to this Pittsburgh game. Maybe they didn't expect what happened against App State, but this season fundamentally, I think, has certain benchmarks and certain really, rod points in the season, if you will. One was this Pittsburgh game, and then the next I don't really think comes until the game against Ohio State at the end of September, and then there's a bye, and then I think clearly Michigan State is kind of that next rod point. So over the course of this next 3 weeks, I guess the focus won't change for this team because James Franklin is coaching it, but as you look at it, what does the team need to accomplish in this next few weeks before they get to that second benchmark of the season, if you will?
I think you just want to see this team play a 60-minute football game on both sides of the ball. I think you can look at both of the past 2 games and say that there were certainly some good things, but when we're sitting there at halftime on Saturday, I'm not sure you really felt enthused about the performance you were seeing. And I think, if you want to look at that game really, Pitt kind of combusted in a lot of ways, and I'm not sure that the blowout was as much a result of how well Penn State was playing. I think it was more that Pitt really just immolated itself in front of a national audience. So, I think you want to see this team play, a strong first half, a strong second half, get one of those 60-minute games against Kent State or Illinois. And then I think you'd feel a lot better going into Ohio State. So I think these next 2 weeks, you would expect them to win both games rather comfortably, but I think you want to see a more even performance that we've seen in the first 2 weeks.
Adam Bittner of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. We always appreciate having you on, my friend, and look forward to doing it again soon.
Absolutely. Great to talk to you.
All right. You too. See you up in State College soon, hopefully.
Sounds good. Talk to you later.
All right. There you go. That is Adam Bittner from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. We certainly appreciate having him on and always brings good perspective on the Penn State Nittany Lions.